Hey there, everyone. Today we're going to be looking at Jean Baudrillard's essay, Our Theatre of Cruelty, from 1982. This essay focuses on the role of terrorism in the contemporary world, particularly featuring Baudrillard's controversial and infamous invocation of the symbolic realm of terrorism over the real realm of terrorism, in order to understand its function and its rise in popularity in the modern world. Now, as I just said, this essay is very controversial. This is some of his most controversial aspects of his theory, and I'm not totally on board with it. There's some interesting stuff to talk about in here, so we'll just kind of go through it, and I'll give you the, well, this could be more nuanced, or no, he's not correct here, as we get to that. And this is split into two parts. The first part is Mogadishu, which is a city in Somalia, and then the second one is Stammheim. Stammheim, of course, being this famous prison complex, one of the most high-tech, high-security prison complexes in the world in Germany, and this was famously the place where Andreas Baader, as well as Ulrike Meinhof, were housed for a time, or imprisoned for a time before they were killed. And especially the death of Andreas Baader, it was unclear whether or not it was a self-suicide with a gun or a government assassination via guns, and he's going to talk about this as we get into the essay. But opening up, he says, in the terrorist act, there is a simultaneous power of death and simulation, which it is intolerable to see confused with the morbid taste of death, and with the frenzy of the morbid and the spectacular. Dead or living, it is elsewhere that terrorism wins out. At least by this single fact, it alone makes the event, and thus returns the whole political order to its nullity. And the media, all the while orchestrating the victory of order, only makes evidence of the opposite reverberate, that terrorism is burying the political order. And the sort of stuff that he's talking about here is emphasized in Fatal Strategies quite a lot, where he looks at certain techniques that are common in social situations in the contemporary world, such as requiring everything to mean something or requiring everything to make sense. This is like when you meet someone, you're expected to know their pronouns or know aspects of them, like on social media in their bio. You're supposed to know all this information about them, be able to fit them in a box really quick, and sort of mechanize them in this social machine. And in contrast to that, and various other kind of almost authoritarian or totalitarian things, Baudrillard is going to oppose Fatal Strategies, whose job is that they operate off of a different logic, specifically a lack thereof of logic. They operate on the realm of seduction, in which the bare objectivity of the world assails one and prevents one from being able to reduce it to information or meaning. It kind of reinvigorates an objectivity of the world that, for Baudrillard, tends to be covered up by media coverage, which he sees as mechanizing truth and reality to the point where those words lose meaning. And as such, terrorism has power through collapse for Baudrillard. And, this is kind of problematic, of course, because Baudrillard is almost romanticizing or even fetishizing the idea of destruction of the current political order for destruction's sake. Considering that Baudrillard only rarely talks about, for example, decolonization struggles, which is one of the preeminent places in which violent political resistance actually has some merit of some kind. He doesn't focus on that at all. He only talks about terrorism in these very broad, abstract strokes, in a way that it seems like he's just valorizing Fatal Strategies for their strategic opposition to a world that he can't tolerate, instead of being able to think about a viable political future, in a real pragmatic political future. Because Baudrillard is concerned with pataphysics, with the science of imaginary solutions, he's perfectly fine to just do the thing he does and just, publish 30, 40 books in his lifetime just talking about random little social things and pumping them full of different theoretical insights, which can be interesting. And he continues, the media are terrorists in their own fashion, working continually to produce good sense, but at the same time violently defeating it by arousing everywhere a fascination without scruples, that is to say, a paralysis of meaning, which retracts to a single scenario. And this theme of the paralysis of meaning, make no mistake, this is not a conservative turn that Baudrillard makes. It's easy to interpret it as such and be like, oh, he's just talking about this crisis of meaning and we need to get back to meaning. No, Baudrillard doesn't think that. Even if he presents it in that language sometime with the paralysis of meaning, it's sort of a lamentation. He makes very clear in both Symbolic Exchange and Death and some Simulacra and Simulation and in Fatal Strategies that this isn't something we can return from. It's something we need to learn how to, refigure out how truth works in the new social situation. And media, for Baudrillard, works on infusing meaning into our daily lives by constantly pumping us with information that has to make sense, and good sense at that. He puts good in parentheses. Because, of course, that's the parenthetical implication of all media, is that it needs to make sense in terms of profitability to a corporation who runs this media monopoly. And media is famously monopolized, and as such, it does, it has this sort of terrorist kind of tone of a couple people masterminding the actions that are going to be taken by, in this case, the media. And Baudrillard thinks that they kind of eat their own foot here. They're violently defeating their own infusing of meaning into scenarios by reducing it to constantly, simultaneously banal and malicious scenarios, especially terrorist attacks, because you're constantly, especially today, you constantly hear about terrorist attacks, school shootings, tornadoes, floods, other natural disasters, and you're constantly pelted with this information. And especially if you talk to a young person who's kind of grown up in this environment, there's a sort of apathy which you can see epitomized in like Gen Z humor, where even the most extreme situations of suffering can take on a sort of apathetic, almost satirical tone as a way to cope with this paralysis of meaning. You put meaning into everything, whether it's Epstein Island and, all sorts of memes come off of that. Everything has to have some sort of meaning, which Baudrillard says is also a form of terrorism. And in terms of describing what terrorism is, he says that it brings together the spectacular and the challenge at their highest points. It is a model of simulation, a micromodel, flashing within a minimally real event inside a maximal echo chamber. Like a crystal thrown into an unstable solution or an experimental matrix, terrorism is an insoluble equation which makes all the variables suddenly appear. Terrorism offers a flash, a scenario, a condensed narrative, opposing the purest form of speculation against every event said to be real. It is a ritual opposing political and historical models in the purest symbolic form of exchange. And it's important to note here that, Baudrillard is famous for popularizing media studies, and really the way he's looking at terrorism here, and this is one of the things I dislike the most about him, is he will minimize, if he even looks at the real oppression and violence committed on people by terrorism, whether it be state terrorism or whether it be, more localized forms of like gang terrorism. He will completely minimize that register and valorize the symbolic exchange aspect of this, which is in part, it can be interesting because in part modern terrorism is about being something that can be symbolically exchanged through media images of, oh, the shock and the horror that's caused by this. And in that sense, especially looking at the aftermath of 9/11, it is an insoluble equation. It's something you can't really make sense of, that someone would do something so horrendous and so seemingly without reason for a lot of Americans who weren't familiar with al-Qaeda or the Middle East at large. I mean, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. So Baudrillard's emphasis on the spectacular and the challenge highlight particularly terrorism's role as an alternative political platform, that it is spectacular in the sense of a spectacle, that it is meant to convey some sort of alternate political order in the form of the spectacle that is terrorism, and it also serves as a challenge to existing state orders, for example. And as such, he says it is subversive because it is insoluble, which is interesting and also problematic because, of course, something being subversive in and of itself doesn't necessarily make it good. Baudrillard rarely is going to give us an ethics, but he will often valorize things, and it seems unclear where he's getting the imperative of subversion from, if everything is just a, kind of in a Derridian sense, like this play of signifiers just operating in this symbolic realm of floating fluids with their own internal logic but no external logic. He continues, "There is neither victory nor defeat. No sense can be made of an event which is irremediably spectacular or irremediably symbolic. Everything in terrorism is ambivalent and reversible. Death, the media, violence, victory. Who plays into the other's hands? Death itself is undefinable." And this is an interesting thing that you'll see in symbolic exchange and death, for example, too. Death is the unexchangeable in its fundamental sense. It is the ceasing of exchange because the thing is dead. And Baudrillard shows how, for example, he talks about like right to life campaigns or technology that is meant to increase lifespan or, kind of generally add to someone's physical well-being in their later years. He shows this to be a way to avoid death. And in avoiding it, it is a microcosm of the larger phenomenon of trying to avoid these insoluble limits like death or unproductivity or unmarketability. And this is an interesting thing that I think is often not talked about with terrorism, is the goal is not territory, but a proliferatable image through the spectacle of violence and dominance. Because if you look at the way that terrorism plays out, this is very similar to just generally guerrilla warfare techniques. This was pioneered by Mao, but also by Che Guevara. The goal is not necessarily territorial dominance in and of itself. Part of the aims of guerrilla warfare and terrorism is to excite others to enter a new political possibility through the proliferation of an image of, oh, you're upset, here's an alternative image. And the reason that this isn't good in and of itself is the same reason that revolution isn't good in and of itself. Hitler's solution served this same end. It was an alternative to a failing political order, to a broken political order, and, one that wasn't always serving people's interests. But using that subversive aspect of a political action, of course, doesn't necessarily make it good. Now, it does make it disruptive, and Baudrillard certainly is going to give more emphasis to disruption for disruption's sake than other theorists will. And this is kind of where you have to meet Baudrillard on his own terms and not accede to what he's saying, but just be like, okay, I get that you have a very narrow way of understanding events, which I can glean something from in terms of looking at, for example, 9/11. And of course, this is written in 82, so this is way before 9/11 or way before anything of the same scale, and the resulting state terrorism that kind of comes out of it. Of course, I say that you have like state terrorism. You can look at, for example, the French intelligence services and counterterrorism services in Algeria that was kind of initiating counter-terror attacks against the FLN, which were themselves just terrorist attacks, but they were considered valid because they were counter-terrorism. And of course, this is kind of what Baudrillard is talking about, is it's just a back and forth of, oh, you're the terrorist, no, you're the terrorist, no, you're the terrorist, I'm the counter-terrorist, no, I'm the counter-terrorist. And it just kind of turns into this mess of, well, who can get better publicity and who can look better in the eyes of the media. And, for example, if you look at Israel and Palestine today, you've got Hamas and you've got the IDF. Both of them are committing terrorist acts. But, of course, Hamas is framed as just a terrorist organization, period, which is reductive because it was democratically elected at one point, and similar to Hezbollah, it serves political means in addition to violent military means. And then you've got the IDF over here, which is, of course, committing terrorist acts way more grand than Hamas, but because it's more recognized internationally, it kind of gets a little bit of a blank check, particularly from the U.S., who is just, no, they're not terrorists, they're freedom fighters. And, what is the difference between terrorists and freedom fighters? Arguably spectacle. Now, it's not quite that simple. I can point to the FLN and I can call them freedom fighters with relative ease. Even though, of course, they were doing violent acts, I would say in general that their anti-colonial resistance was justified as a form of freedom, of seeking their freedom. But Baudrillard is kind of accentuating this spectacular aspect of terrorism versus counterterrorism, of freedom fighter versus terrorism. It kind of depends on how you stack the cards. He continues, the death of the terrorists is equivalent to the death of the hostages. In spite of all efforts to set them into radical opposition, fascination allows no distinction to be made. Rightly so, because power makes no final distinction either, but settles its accounts with everyone. And this describes the state of Israel perfectly. The death of the terrorists becomes equivalent to the deaths of the hostages being the everyday Palestinian, which becomes equivalent to the death of Hamas. For example, when the IDF bombed al-Shifa hospital. Well, Hamas was underneath. They had tunnels underneath. I'm waiting for evidence to show that they were even there. This was clearly just not even an indiscriminate bombing. It was a discriminate bombing aimed at the livelihood of Palestinians and the infrastructure to ensure their continued livelihood. And as such, this fascination with Zionism, with trying to combat anti-Semitism, which gets conflated with Zionism by people like Netanyahu and turns into, oh, if you're anti-Semitic, you're against the state of Israel. And if you're against the state of Israel, you're anti-Semitic. Just this total conflation that, of course, does a disservice to Jews who are against Zionism and against the atrocities of the state of Israel. But we can see that with this fascination, this spectacular element of terrorism, it is easy for the conflation between terrorists and hostages to occur. Between Hamas and innocent Palestinians, between Israelis and, people in the IDF. It's easy for this to go both ways. And he says that it is unable to unravel these deaths and rediscover the fine dividing line, the distinctive and valid oppositions which are the secret of law and order. And of course, one of the alarming things is the distinctive and valid oppositions. This is not even really the secret of law and order anymore, because you can use a general label like Hamas to refer to any Arab you want to. It doesn't have to be, aimed at anyone in particular. There doesn't have to be any specific criteria, even in terms of military engagement for like drone strikes. As long as Hamas is suspected of being in a building, it is Hamas operated, it is housed by Hamas, and as such, it is a legitimate target. So this is an important element of terrorism that Baudrillard is accentuating here. This is one of the key points for understanding what Baudrillard is saying. He says, the force of the terrorists comes precisely from the fact that they have no logic. Now, this has its problems, because you can look at someone like the FLN, the Front de Libération Nationale, the National Liberation Front in Algeria, and you can say, oh, they had no logic, and that's what makes them subversive. That's what made them successful. And in part, this is the case. It's the same reason that the Americans got so frightened by being in Vietnam, is the proliferation of guerrilla warfare techniques by the Vietnamese was something that the Americans didn't know how to deal with. They were in a completely foreign terrain, much like some of, the trying to get into Russia, and, you run against this snowy terrain that foreign powers don't know how to deal with. Same thing in Vietnam. They didn't know how to deal with this terrain. They didn't know how to deal with the logicless, in a sense, the logicless action of the Vietnamese. So in a sense, this is true, that it doesn't have a logic in the traditional sense of methods of engagement. And of course, this goes both ways. Just like I was talking about with the IDF, they have no logic in a sense too. They have a very abstract logic, what de la Zingueterie would call an axiomatic, of, kill Hamas, for example. But that axiomatic can go beyond any limits of supposed military engagement or an international law. And it turns into this just back and forth of, well, I'm logical and thus I'm a freedom fighter, and you're illogical and thus you're a terrorist. Or, and this is the weird thing, he says that terrorists are demanded to be at the same time illogical, which gives them their power, and logical tacticians, which would make them successful. It's this weird, it's almost like when Said is talking about Orientalism, and he says that Western conceptions of the Orient were filled with contradictions between, for example, people in the Orient being stupid and unable to rule themselves, and thus that justified colonization. But also there's this famous Oriental despotism, this sort of conniving, sly ability. Oh, they're so smart, they know how to scheme you, and they know how to take your money. It's like, which are they, stupid or genius? It can't be both. Of course, they're neither. That's too reductive. That's what happens when you use stereotypes, when you use these spectacular images to understand the other. And Baudrillard implants this onto terrorism, and he says, look, there's this double logic of, they're illogical and mysterious, and that's why the Vietnamese are able to defeat us, because they're savages, they have no logic. Of course, I'm caricaturing, I don't actually think that. And then on the other hand, they're logical, they're tacticians, they have these crazy military strategies that are completely beyond our comprehension. It's like, which are they? Illogical or logical? Baudrillard says that this is the fantasy of synthesis, of defense on our part, which allows us to recuperate in the fury of defeat. Right? This is what the Americans were doing after Vietnam, is trying to find some justification for, this is why we couldn't do things in Vietnam, because they were just, they were savages or whatever, or some sort of stupid logic for understanding something which is binarily concerned with, it's either logical or illogical. Now, Baudrillard wants to say that the terrorist has no logic, and we should understand by this not the traditional logic. For example, Paul Virilio in Speed and Politics talks about the change in military strategy that goes from controlling territory to occupying and managing the flow of territory. So for a time, a military, success was being able to overpower an enemy such that you could build some kind of stable wall around your territory. And that was what defined your dominance of a territory. Look at the modern world, and you see that territory is very different. Because who has power in a territory is not just like de jure what's on the Constitution of, such and such party has power. If you look at a lot of decolonized countries, for example, there is so much soft power operating on them from the outside of, for example, Myanmar, of being a place where labor is outsourced by first world countries such that they can bypass labor laws, they can get cheaper labor, and then they can make more profit. So in this situation, you could say Myanmar is dominated by parties within Myanmar, but you could also say that it's dominated by foreign powers which have economic power over it. And of course, economies is defined by circulation, by being able to continue circulation of currency and circulation of information. So there's a changing logic of dominance that happens from merely occupying to regulating and to facilitating control and expansion and circulation. And this, of course, is something that the terrorist will play with a little bit, because they will play with the circulation of images. And for Baudrillard, that is what has their power, is it's a circulation of images not solely concerned with, killing 17 people is not going to suddenly topple a government, obviously. And you could argue, well, it's just one small battle and it will slowly culminate in the defeat of a government. In terms of material strategy, many terrorist groups don't have that in mind. If you look at 9/11, for example, and you look at some of al-Qaeda's reasons for doing the attack the way they did, it was equally in terms of trying to cause mass civilian casualties as it was pure disruption of the Western political and social order for the purposes of inciting violence and inciting counter-violence for the purposes of destabilizing Western countries, and as a result, causing fearful Arabs in the Middle East, fearful Muslims in the Middle East, to join al-Qaeda. So in part, it was just for destabilization's sake, and also to get a message out there, to proliferate political power and dominance of an ideology, not solely through material logical means, but through disruption. You can look at, for example, the IRA in Ireland that is doing all these terrorist attacks against Britain, and there's some crazy ones in London that were just sheerly for upsetting the British economic sphere. So they weren't even concerned with civilian lives. In fact, they would purposely try to avoid mass civilian casualties, and they would make sure to send out messages in advance to try to evacuate civilians. Now, this didn't always work, but at least the intention was there. But the IRA was concerned with sending a message and upsetting economic power without necessarily just reverting to the classic logic of, how many was I able to kill? That's not really what Baudrillard thinks that the modern terrorist is trying to do. Now, Baudrillard thinks that the transportation of terrorism into the media, its coverage in the media, equally is terrorist and also masks state terrorism by stultifying us in our concern for meaning. He says, hence the stupidity and the obscenity of all that is reported about the terrorists. Everywhere the wish to palm off meaning on them, to exterminate them with meaning, which is more effective than the bullets of specialized commandos. So the need to attach a logic or a meaning or a sense to the terrorists is the reason Baudrillard thinks that they can be so effective, is that they don't reduce to meaning. They are in part about disturbing meaning, disturbing our classical understandings of political power, of dominance, of security, of sovereignty, in a way that, of course, is aimed at disruption and changing the world order through discriminate and indiscriminate acts. This is, of course, accentuating the realm of the challenge that Baudrillard spoke of earlier. He says, the stakes are not to beat power on its own ground, but to oppose another political order of force. So, a different way of dealing with force, with violence, and with struggle. He continues, one knows nothing about terrorism if one does not see that it is not a question of real violence, nor of opposing one violence to another, which, owing to their disproportion, is absurd. All real violence, like real order in general, is always on the side of power. But to oppose to the full violence and to the full order a clearly superior model of extermination and virulence operating through emptiness. And this is part of the mirror that terrorism is for Baudrillard. It takes the logic of society, which, for example, is concerned with meaning, with filling us up with meaning, and in so doing, turning us into an empty husk. Taking this logic and reflecting it back on itself. And in so doing, forcing the system to change its methods. He writes, the secret is to oppose to the order of the real an absolutely imaginary realm, completely ineffectual at the level of reality, but whose implosive energy absorbs everything real and all the violence of real power which founders there. And this is the definition of fatal strategies for Baudrillard, in the most overt and literal sense, as well as the metaphorical sense of, technically, fatal strategies for Baudrillard don't have to be just with violence. There can be other ways to enact a fatal strategy. But literally here, the point of the fatality of terrorism here is to absorb the real and kind of throw it back at us. Throw back at us the reality that is manufactured by media and use that as a strategy which doesn't pretend to create some grand narrative of an alternative. No, it's almost a pragmatic alternative within the dystopian limits of the system. And of course, this really is accelerationism, and this is part of the dark side of accelerationism, which is interesting theory to learn about, but I'm not sure it's very conducive to our traditional notions of justice, of sovereignty, of power, and Baudrillard is aware of that. He knows that this is a different logic that he's using, and, as such, we kind of have to take from him what we can, take from his analyses what we can, and throw out what might be problematic. That's okay. That's part of the beauty of reading Baudrillard, is you don't have to be dogmatic with Baudrillard. You don't have to go down all the rabbit holes that he wants to go down for it to be interesting in terms of social analysis. But that being said, he continues, in such a system, all that comes into contradiction with it, including the violence of its opposite, only makes its expansion accelerate. Here, the virulence comes from the implosion, and the death of the terrorists, or of the hostages, is of implosive order. The abolition of value, of meaning, of the real at a determined point. This point can be infinitesimal, and yet it provokes a suction, an absorption, a gigantic convection, as was seen at Mogadishu. Around this tiny point, the whole system of the real condenses, is immunized, and launches all its antibodies. It becomes so dense that it goes beyond its own laws of equilibrium and involutes in its own over-effectiveness. At bottom, the profound tactic of simulation for the terrorist model is very much a matter of simulation and not of real death, is to provoke an excess of reality and to make the system collapse under an excess of reality. And this is, there was a very problematic line in there, which is something that Baudrillard continues to get, heat for. The terrorist model is very much a matter of simulation and not of real death. Now, granted that reality for Baudrillard is different. It's not simply material, physical matter, but it's also, for example, the reality of ideologies or narratives that exist in the media and that via their proliferation and their manufactured consent become real. Granted that, I think that's still a very problematic statement and one that takes away the bad side of terrorism, the unequivocally nasty side of terrorism. And this is why even someone who's going to look at like the FLN in Algeria and say that their struggle was justified, you're still not going to say that it was just benevolent or good. No, it's not really that simple. There's a collapse of morality in such situations of oppression that just faces you with the lesser of two evils. And you're still doing something evil. You're still killing other people. But it's something that has to be viewed in its historical contingencies and understood as the lesser of two evils. And I think by Baudrillard collapsing that element of reality, he is valorizing terrorism in a way that I think goes over the top and gives way to any political violence that is considered subversive as such. This is the dark side of radical theory. It is radical for radicality's sake, and it is something that accelerationism thrives on. Pretending like it's radical or revolutionary in the sense of what revolution is really for getting out from under oppression, from helping save people's lives from impeding death. It takes that notion of revolution or radicality and turns it into something rather complacent, something that the accelerationists are very common, that they're very acquainted with, like Land or, Fisher, of basically sending the reins off to capitalism and saying, you know what, we'll just accelerate the system and we'll let it implode itself. But in terms of understanding Baudrillard's theory here, of course, he's speaking of immunization and antibodies. And I think thinking of this like cell biology is rather a helpful way of thinking about this. A cell is trying to maintain homeostasis or equilibrium. It is controlling the flow of substances coming in and out of it, controlling the metabolic processes inside of it, and as such, it has an economy of exchange. And for Baudrillard, interrupting that exchange through excess from the inside is the best strategy. Because, for example, terrorism is almost kind of like the cancerous cell coming from the inside. It has a logic that can't be overwritten, but, it's the pure death instinct as such. It can't be overcoded. It overcodes the overcoder. It terrorizes the terrorist, and in so doing leads to this collapse, which I'm always confused why the accelerationists like this collapse, because of course in human terms this corresponds to the collapse of civilization, which I'm not excited for. I don't know about any of you. And as such, I find confusing something like, for example, paradoxical death is where the reality of death is suspended. This edge where it acquires the status of a challenge that is symbolic before becoming real, a residue. The real always being only the residual principle of death's degradation and what's left over. I mean, this is very much valorizing death. And it's interesting to think about the limits of our systems and what could happen beyond those limits. I don't want to go past those limits. I don't want to flirt with this paradoxical death of the challenge as such, which is the challenge to the well-being of real people. And that's, of course, the downfall of part of Baudrillard's theory, is it takes the reality out of death, the death of death, and turns it into a bit of an abstraction, a bit of maybe something ideal. He says, it matters little that the reality of this death, the truth about ... is stolen from you. Since it is not of the order of the real, therein lies its force. You are the one who depreciates it by wanting to institute it as fact, as capital with the value of death, and extinguish it in death. Whereas this death at full price, not liquidated in the equivalence of meaning and vengeance, opens a cycle of vertigo in which the system itself can only come to be implicated in the end, or brutally through its own death. So, this is the give me liberty or give me death in the postmodern realm. He continues, thus everyone will exhaust themselves finishing the work and going to the end of the truth. A subtle incitement to self-management. He's concerning here the need to find truth, the need for media to infuse truth. The government is content to produce an event involving death. Others will put the finishing touches on the job. The truth. So the media here for Baudrillard tries to dissolve the indissoluble, that being death, via truth and meaning. And we sort of have to fill it in because, of course, there is no truth as such in the sense of what does this mean? There is the very physical, very real reality of the death of innocent people, especially in terrorist situations, which Baudrillard is just so quick to dismiss. And there's, of course, the symbolic meaning, which is a little bit more fluid. It is a little bit more like the difference between terrorists and freedom fighters. That, of course, is very much a liminal state of political reality that is forever going to be in the hands of whoever has the power to create the narrative. So in that sense, Baudrillard's theory is interesting, but it's very necessary to take it with the grain of salt and not give into it too much, such that you become reactionary through your radicality. So that's it for this lecture. I hope it's been helpful. Check out any of my other stuff I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, other literature. Become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. That's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.